So thank you so much, Augie, for coming on and participating in our SETSI YouTube channel, Go-Getters, Movers, and Shakers in our community, really making a difference. And we really want to appreciate you, honor you, and thank you on behalf of SETSI. So thanks again for this.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored myself because I sit on a board with Victor and I know the work that he does. And I've watched many of your interviews and Melanie Thomas was just on, and Melanie's also one of the board members at Tribe. So I really love the work that SETSI's doing, especially in the international scope. So I'm privileged and proud to be here.
Awesome. Thanks again. Thank you so much. Okay, so before we start our interview, as we always do, we begin all things by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and tell us about your amazing work.
Well, I'm Augy Augustou. So my full name is Augustou, Agasou. People call me Augy. I'm presently sitting here now as principal of a community college in Nova Scotia, Canada. In a couple of days, I'll become the executive director of African Nova Scotian Affairs. So for those that aren't familiar with Canada, and I know you have a very international audience, there's a province on the east of Canada, Nova Scotia, that has had Black people here for probably over 300 years. In the late 1800s, the British colonizer wanted to destabilize the American economy. So they said to any Black person in the Americas, if they wanted to escape to Canada to be a Black loyalist, they would take you into Canada. So hundreds of and thousands of over 60 years, 70 years of people who were Africans who were in slavery escaped to Nova Scotia. And so we've had communities here since the late 1700s, and those communities still exist. So I'm an African Nova Scotian. Both of my parents are born in Nova Scotia. And as I say, I am about to embark on the job as executive director of African Nova Scotian Affairs in the province, which is a cultural heritage and tourism position.
Amazing. And every time I hear about, the journey and the beginning of Black people in Nova Scotia, it's so heartwarming. I have some friends too that came from there, and it's just, I love hearing the story, and it should be recognized all the time, because it's really deep rooted for sure over there.
Yeah, and I appreciate, the SETSI platform because, for me to listen to stories from Ghana and listen to stories from Jamaica, it's interesting how our stories are very similar, as we, especially in the diaspora, are trying to, find the same thing you talk about, freedom and liberty, sovereignty, control over our own lives. And I think that's what happened for us African Nova Scotians. And in Canada, on the landscape, that differs. Montreal is different. Montreal has a large Haitian population, and it's a French-speaking, primarily French-speaking situation. Toronto has a lot of Black people that have been in Ontario since the 40s and 50s and 60s. But when we talk about being in Canada as a Black person since the 1700s, that's pretty much a Nova Scotian experience.
Most definitely. Totally agree with that. And could you just articulate your personal mission and vision for us?
Yeah, I guess, the thing it takes a village, and we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. My father was Augy Jones, and he, on the East Coast, was a civil rights activist and lawyer. And so I grew up, and my mom also was an activist and worked in the law industry. She was like a liaison between the legal system and our community. trying to direct our community who they should be talking to when they had a legal issue, which can often be a barrier. So I had two parents that were very much connected to the liberation and sovereignty of Black people and the love for Africa. So I grew up in that. And I remember like our household was always full of all kinds of different people, Black people, white people, people from the Caribbean, people from Africa, people from Norway. And I was like this little sponge. Like I would just sit around and just, listen to these conversations. I was born in 1968. So in the early 70s, I was a young kid listening to, stories of how rough it was to grow up. And I didn't know, I was 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old, but the adults were talking about what it was like to grow up in Nova Scotia at the time. We're 2% of the population here. So, racism was high and still exists here, of course, but it was much more prominent in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so I grew up listening to those conversations. I also grew up, in a household where I knew what good conversation meant. And for us as people of African ancestry, you can walk in a room and think we're arguing, but we're not. We're socializing. We have that level of volume, and there could be multiple conversations, and we're okay with that. And so I did learn too very quickly that in what people may call crunchy conversations, we're pretty normalized. I mean, I find now at 55 years old, I can get in and out of tough conversations very easily because from the time I was small, I saw that model. Like no one has to leave angry. And if you leave angry, you still got to come back because you want food and you want drink and you want conversation next weekend. So don't go away mad. You might as well work it out. And also everyone doesn't have to totally agree all the time. So I grew up with a community oriented mindset. So as a teenager, when I was in school systems and running for student council and all these type of things, I had this cultural armor that my parents gave me, a metaphorical armor. I don't care, you call me the N-word, you can say whatever you want. I'm not gonna listen to you. I know I'm a strong African boy with intelligence and talents, and no one can stop me from doing what I need to do. So even in a 2% situation, I did well in school. I also played basketball. My mandate was always, to your question, community-based. It's funny, I come to work every day, and this thing around being at work for community has been my mission my whole life because I saw my parents do it. And my next role as executive director of African Nova Scotian Affairs in the province will be able to illuminate that role even more. So I think that what I see is my role being is sometimes we're sitting at very small tables and they only invite one or two voices. And I think it's important that in behind my voice is the hundreds and thousands of African Nova Scotian community members that hopefully I'm articulating their voice as much as possible. At the same time, sitting at the table saying, don't listen to my word. I'm only one Black person. So you need to talk to the community because I may be able to articulate a little bit what they mean, but if you really want to know how to solve community problems in Black communities, you got to talk to the community.
Beautiful. I mean, so much to unpack what you just said. Like, it's such a beautiful thing when you have parents that are already in that mindset and they're raising you in that mindset. So it's already a part of your DNA,
Yeah.
To be the voice for the voiceless and also voice ancestrally because, the Scotians ancestrally that are no longer with us, you are a voice for them as well, because what they didn't get a chance to say within you, because that's how you were raised, you're also be able to permeate that, which is, I'm getting goosebumps right now, actually.
That's a great
Beautiful.
point. And I have to say, this is funny because Nova Scotia Community College is a government college. And I remember my dad saying to me, this would have been like mid 80s. And he said, Augie, they'll never hire me in government because at the time his name was too controversial and he was fighting the good fight. And when we think about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, many of our parents were fighting outside the system. They couldn't even get jobs within government, but they were fighting. And so we, as their ancestors, as their offspring, I've had government jobs only because of what my parents did and the elders before me. So I feel that that's not even a cliche. Like I feel that the doors that are open for me to be executive director of African Nova Scotian Affairs or principal at a community college in Nova Scotia. I didn't open those doors myself, not at all. That's my ancestors and my people that came before me in my community in a rough situation, banging on doors, knocking down doors, just so I can have that opportunity.
Perfect. Beautifully said. And what inspires you most about your current work?
I think the word that comes to mind is impact. I remember before I had this job, I was working for our provincial Department of Education, and the executive director was Dr. Marlene Ruck Simmons. And between the two of us, I was the director. We started to use this word impact, and we almost, and this analogy we were using was somebody in a boxing workout room, and there's a punching pad in front of them. And if you're punching, and you're never hitting the pad, you're not making impact. And so what inspires me every day is I want to hit the pad. You know, I mean, our parents have been at the same conversation, and it starts to get on a treadmill that we're talking the same conversation, oftentimes to a status quo Eurocentric system that really on purpose doesn't want to listen, because they're either slow learners or they don't want to listen. So our focus was, what can we put together policy-wise, systemically, data-driven, that would allow us to hit the bag, which means impact our communities. And so every role that I've been in, I've tried to make sure that there was an impact on community. I'll give an example. Here at Nova Scotia Community College, I'm the principal, was the principal of one campus. And that campus is the closest campus to North Preston, East Preston, Cherrybrook, Lake Loon, and these are Black communities. And so when I got the job 2 years ago, I thought the biggest impact I could have is to make this venue open to Black programming. Because oftentimes you have an idea for a program, but once you start to put it together and you have to rent a space, and you know, after a while now, those are barriers to you presenting the program. So since I've been here, we've had the Black Health Network here, both men and women. We've had, we have a Provincial Economic Road to Prosperity. They did a 4-day conference here. We had a combination program for financial literacy and basketball mixed into one program. We've had African Nova Scotian cooking mixed into a program for youth. So I find the impact of what I could do with like the most easy low-hanging fruit was open up the building and have community access this building at very affordable rates, free or at least paying for the services that we offered, but making it very affordable. And so that impacted the community, because every time I would go out to see these events and I see my cousins, my aunts, people I grew up with, like I see people in my community, but they had something that they had in their mind that is coming to fruition at Akerley campus just because we gave them access to the venue. And so I could see it having an impact. It felt like I was hitting the bag. And so as I move into this new role, it's not just a campus. Now we're talking provincially. I want to make sure that I'm listening and following the voices of the community. And we have a diverse community. Some people live in very rural settings. A lot of the Black communities that I spoke of that have been here for 300 years are not in the middle of Halifax. They're not urban communities. They're actually pretty rural communities. And even when it comes to white people, there's a disconnect between urban and rural. And so I want to make sure that from an African Nova Scotian landscape, that there's an impact on Black communities in rural settings, that there's an impact for Black women, that there's an impact for Black mental health, that there's an impact for Black people as they celebrate their culture, not only as African Nova Scotians, because I would say when you come here, you're in Nova Scotia. So that does make African Nova Scotians somewhat primary. But then as it ripples out, we have people from the Caribbean that have been here for decades. We have people from Africa that have been here for decades. So we're all one African diaspora. And I want to make sure that we have a positive impact on all of those ripples of Black people.
Beautiful. I remember growing up with we used to have the community centers coming together, and, they don't even have that anymore for the kids. So you just saying that really brought back memories. And now you're making an impact within the Black community to focus on togetherness, unity. Doesn't matter if you're in the rural area, doesn't matter if you're in the city. We're all one people coming together, whether from Africa,
Yes.
it doesn't matter. So that's beautiful. Really, really good. And now, what challenges or barriers have you faced in your work? And how are you, or if you have a team, how are you guys working to overcome it?
Well, I think the barriers, and I've come to this, when I in the early 90s, I spent 4 years teaching in St. Lucia. I spent a year teaching in Georgetown, Guyana. I taught in Kingston, Jamaica for a year, and I taught 4 years in Nassau, Bahamas. And what I found from coming from the 2% of Black Nova Scotians, I found that being in the majority Black situation as an educator, we never really talked about race as much. And as we know, even in these islands, there's still that silent white power structure a lot of times. So I'm not going to go there. That's a different conversation. But I think in general, it was revolutionary for me to be in a majority situation where I turned on the TV and the commercials were Black people and the newscasters were Black people and the police were Black people and the criminals were Black people and the politicians were Black people. And that may seem pretty elementary to some people, but I had my first all Black dream when I was 22 years old. Right? Because there's a thing around being in a majority and seeing yourself over and over again. But when you grow up in Nova Scotia and you barely see yourself, that has a play on your mindset. So to say that white people were always somewhere in the dream, somewhere in the existence, that's because you grow up at 2%. So that does bring me to answering your question is, I think the biggest challenge here in Nova Scotia is that we are only 2% of the population. And so that still makes up 200,000 people. But it's not a large population. So when it comes to, do we have a lot of restaurants? Do we have any credit unions? Do we have, housing areas where there's a positive living experience of affluence for African Nova Scotians? We don't have that. And so the challenge is to be in a minority situation, but yet still try to get the same freedom and sovereignty that you and respect and cultural harmony, Black joy that people talk about. We want to have that here too, but it's a lot harder to do that in Halifax, New Scotland, than it is to do in the Grill, or that it is to do in Soufrière, or that it is to do in Accra or in Lagos. So in that it's to be fully African, fully proud, fully capable, have access to things when you're only 2%. And in that minority situation, you often get the offshoots and dysfunctionalities of that. So racism, lack of access to funds, a stereotyping of your community. Like when you're only 2%, it's very easy for those things to happen. And again, that's also unique to Nova Scotia because in Montreal, some of these same things, we know that the same incidents of racism in the school system exist in Montreal and Toronto and Vancouver, wherever in Canada. But here it's somewhat accentuated because I often say, we look at the United States as the North and the South. So Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana are in the South. And in the North, we have, New York City and, Philadelphia and those type of things. Well, in Canada, we flip it, right? So the East Coast is the South. So this is not Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's Halifax, Mississippi. It's Halifax, Louisiana. It's, what I mean? It's Halifax, Alabama, right? And so some of the same characteristics of growing up in the South as a Black person is what it's like to grow up in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick or Prince Edward Island or Newfoundland, right? And only we have much smaller numbers. So I would say that's the biggest challenge is the demographics of how many people we have. And we know that demographics leads to how much voting share do you have? How much of the GP, the gross national product or provincial money making, what part are you of that? How many Black businesses are there? Like we have just a low number because of the low number of people of African ancestry that we have in the province.
That's it. I totally understand that, when you say 2%, but you know what? It's like every piece of the puzzle is important, whether
Yeah.
it's the 2% of it or what. And your role is so important because that small percent, actually, it might be easier for you to gather them and speak with them. Sometimes the larger it is, the harder it is to kind of communicate the importance of unity and coming together. But the small percentage, you know, you will make an impact. I know you will, for sure.
Well, it's funny you say that, and I do want to add this because you brought up a great point. So,
Mhm.
in that difference, what we have done in Canada is we have an African Nova Scotian Affairs. That's what I'm going to be the executive director of. We have an African Canadian um, services branch in the Department of Ed. Like, so we have a report called the Black Report, which is Black Learners Advisory Council. And if you Google that, it's a 3-volume um, uh, research project on Black students in Nova Scotia. So what's funny is in the 2%, to your point, we've done some things that Ontario hasn't done. We are embedded in government, unlike Quebec, unlike Alberta. So you're right. In our smallness, we've been able to set up some structures of protection and voice within government that are not duplicated in this country.
There you go. Beautiful. And what are your key priorities right now? What would you say your key priorities at this current time?
I'm very focused on life beyond trauma. I think that there's a way, and if you look up, there's a psychologist, Adler, who talks about getting beyond your trauma in a micro level. I think for us in Nova Scotia, we spent a lot of time talking about how oppressive it is here, which is truthful. That's true. Trauma is a real thing. But I think we now need to get to defining ourselves, um, uh, celebrating ourselves, marketing ourselves, loving ourselves. All of these things are beyond trauma. I'll give you an example. So, as I'm moving into this new position, I would be equivalent to the executive director of Acadian Affairs, which is the French population, the executive director of Gaelic Affairs, which is the Scottish Gaelic group that's here, that's the majority. We also have an executive director of Ilnu Affairs or Mi'kmaq Affairs. And what's interesting the other day, that all of those cultures have license plates. And I know this is only small, but it's a micro example of what I'm talking about. There's a license plate for Gaelic people to identify with. There's a license plate for Acadian people to identify with. There's a Mi'kmaq license plate. There's a veterans license plate. There's a firefighter's license plate. But there's no African Nova Scotian license plate. And so part of that is that we've been so focused on racism and the things that were traumatizing us that we haven't been able to go forward to say we also would like a license plate. And so I think that's my mandate. Going forward is to define what it is to be Black in Nova Scotia, to celebrate that in our history of resilience, centuries of resilience, 300 years of resilience and prospering, and celebrate that. And then finally, even when it comes to tourism, we have a lot of people even in Canada that say, "Oh, you have Black people in Nova Scotia?" Right? So we are at the other end is really marketing and having people come visit, because that's a huge part of enhancing your culture, is to have people appreciate that and have local people that are in the tourism, culinary, hospitality industry create spaces for people to come and enjoy our culture. That doesn't mean that we forgot about slavery and continuous systemic racism and things like that. We haven't forgotten about that. But I do think that, if you say, what am I focused on in the future the most? And what are my goals as executive director at African Nova Scotian Affairs? It's definitely to get beyond trauma.
I love that so much because something here in Ghana, like that's how it was. Like 2019 was the year of return, it was called, and open door policy for all Black diasporans to come in, get your chance to get permanent residency, just feel, open and welcome. And it was a huge success. So really highlighting, Black Nova Scotians, like you're saying, in the culinary arts, what's your food taste like? And I've tried it before because I have a friend, as I told you, it's really tasty. Dance, culture. Oh my goodness, I can imagine. Yeah. So I love that. Getting beyond the trauma because, it's like there's a machine that feeds off of trauma, fear, and those things. It empowers it, keeps the lights on for some reason, but now it's time to create our own light and a positive light, for us for sure. So I love that. Love that. And so what does success look like to you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've had that question asked of me lately. I recently also was chair of, we had an environmental racism panel. So for the last year, I've been the chair of a panel, which was three experts from the Mi'kmaq community on environment and racism, three from the African Canadian community, and we had a gentleman from European ancestry who was a policy expert that made up the group. And oftentimes I was being interviewed to say, what would be successful for the panel? And I always said, if community says so. When I walk through community, my sense of success is having day-to-day, everyday people who I'm connected to say that this is working for them, this is impacting them. I don't really put a whole lot of stock in what organizations outside of our community will deem as successful, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, whatever. I find that I really do base success on first voice feedback, first voice criticism, first voice compliments from community members that are saying, life is better for me. I have more access to. Thank you for starting that networking event because I've benefited from that. That's the type of feedback that I think is the most important for me. Sometimes it's very hard to measure, I guess. It has an emotional value for sure. But yet I would say that for me is success is that the community feels the impact of some of the initiatives I've been a part of and feels the impact positively, that things are better for them. And to me, that is the definite centerpiece for what I would deem success.
Beautiful. Love it. Love it. I have nothing to say after that. That was great. So, in closing, what are your closing thoughts and your call to action at this time?
Well, I would align it with the work that SETC does. I think that, whether it's in Toronto or Accra or Halifax or Kingston or Lagos or, it doesn't matter. I think that there's a lot of power when we talk minority majority, really as people of African ancestry, we are the majority. We have millions and millions of people. And I think that kind of shaking our heads coming out of the whole transatlantic, slave trade system was set up to make people be disconnected. And so now that we're in the year 2023 or 2024, I think that it is a time for unity. And I think, and Victor and I talked about this when we first met, is, I was very much into, I'm African Nova Scotian. And Victor's like, yeah, but we're all Black. And there's this tension around that conversation. And I do think that there's a sense that someone can own being Jamaican. And I think about Rastafarians in particular, own being Jamaican, but have a great love for Africa. I can own being African Nova Scotian, but have a great love for Africa. And really, the power source is not me being Nova Scotian. The power source is me being African, right? Like that's where the millions of people are, and they're all over the globe. And think about the ways that we can, promote trade and prosperity and banking and cryptocurrency and digital information and networking and film and music and culture and tourism and education. Like, I'll give you an example. We have Black students here in Nova Scotia. Why are we not aligning with historically Black colleges in the US or Black universities in Africa, right? We're trying to get we're at the level now where we're just trying to get our Black students into white schools. There's got to be a level beyond that. And in the unification of Black people, then why don't we have cohorts of African Nova Scotian students going to school in Uganda, in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, in Jamaica at UWI, or going to a historically Black college in the southern US. Like there, we're mixing Black people with Black people, and that's, I think, the stage that we're at. Coming out of COVID, there's a definite global sense. And so I think that's what my last word would be is to continue to do the work where you own where you were born. I own that I'm African Nova Scotian, but the thing that is my energy source is that I'm African. And knowing that that's the connection I want to make on a global level to people that through DNA think like me, look like me, have had similar experiences. I think we're always trying to fight to get European people to notice us and pay attention to us and write our curriculum and set up stuff for us. That's not going to happen. So if we look to each other, I think that can happen.
Absolutely. That was perfect because, the youth is the next generation coming. So we have to plant the seed from now, from baby stage. I have a 1-year-old grandbaby, and I tell you the vocabulary on this little girl. She knows so much. You tell her one thing, she's mastered it. There's no need to tell her again. So these are the type of generation of our children that are coming. They're already pre-wired.
Yes.
All you have to do is feed them. That's it. So I love that you're saying, why don't we have, our Black Scotian students in Ghana, in Nigeria, and, and that's so important. And it would be so embraced, I'm telling you, because through art, through music, through dance, through food, we're already united. So that's like a no-brainer, so I really, really, I love that. I just love that idea. I think that'd be amazing. So, Augy, this was such an amazing interview. I really appreciate it. I learned so much. I'm already trying to think, okay, when am I coming to Nova Scotia?
Well, we're going to connect. I'll make sure we connect after this.
Yes, most definitely. So, and I hope people, when this airs, they'll also embrace it, learn from it, and other Scotians from all over the world who's traveled to also come and connect with Augy and see how you can give back, or hey, I traveled to the US, but I can't forget my homeland. What can I do to help? All of that is so vital too. So again, I appreciate you on behalf of SETSI. We appreciate this interview, and we will end the way we began by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands that we were on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So again, Augy, we appreciate you. And yes, we will connect soon.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated the conversation.
Definitely. Same here. Likewise.
Take care.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.